So welcome to the Bitcoin Worldview series. This is the second episode, and our topic now is asking the question, how do we know? Bitcoin is a communication protocol of distributed decentralized databases. And then Bitcoin also has this slogan of don't trust, verify. So in light of that, we can ask the question, is communication possible? And how, if at all, can we trust the knowledge that we acquire through our senses? And I will be presenting a practical approach to this topic and drawing metaphors from how Bitcoin operates. We'll have ample time for questions and discussions when I'm done. But also, feel free, if you have a pressing question, you can just jump in while I'm sharing. I'm okay with a little chaos with that. We can deal with that. We'll just keep this open and free. I do have some slides I will share with you later on. But before we do that, let's start with this question that is part of the description. What is communication, and is it possible? This is really one of my favorite questions, and it is actually closely related to the topic on knowledge, and it has more than meets the eye at first sight. So, number one, at the basic level, communication is sharing and receiving data or knowledge. That's kind of obvious. As an example, when I started my little umbrella Bitcoin Fullnode, it took weeks to work through all the Bitcoin transactions, starting with the first one from January 2009. My connection was probably pretty slow because for most people, I think it takes less than a week. But for me, it took, I think, close to 3 weeks. Now, my umbrella node got this data from other full nodes, literally bit by bit, 1 by 1, 0 by 0, and then verifying each transaction before adding it to my copy of the Bitcoin database. So we can say this is communication or sharing of data in the Bitcoin world. A full node being starting up and receiving all the data from the other nodes, and now my full node is part of that decentralized distributed network, sharing and receiving data. Now, when I build my worldview, I take in data. I receive data from others. And before I add it to my worldview, so to speak, if I'm doing a good job, I verify it. Similar as the Bitcoin node should verify the transactions before they are added in. So that's kind of the metaphor here, that as we are building our knowledge or building our worldview, we receive data and we verify it before we add it. That's the first point. Communication is sharing and receiving data or knowledge. And then the second point is this question, if there is no absolute truth, is communication possible? And we talked about fixed truth or absolute truth in our conversation with Jimmy Song. And my answer to this is no. If everything is relative, if there is no real knowledge, then our communication ends up being just like a meaningless game. If the knowledge that we are communicating is not real, then communication becomes meaningless, because communication is just then handling something that doesn't have any meaning anyway. Feel free to push back on that, but that's my answer to that. And then thirdly, without communication, building our personal knowledge would be hard or impossible. So my answer to this question is communication possible? Is a firm yes. I believe it's possible because we have fixed truth and because communication is then dealing with real knowledge and real truth. Now, for our purposes in the Bitcoin Worldview series, the implication of this is that those that are active in communication, active in sharing and receiving, they are more likely than others to have a healthy and solid worldview. Just like if you take in the Bitcoin worldview or Bitcoin world, a Bitcoin node that is frequently disconnected and not communicating with the other nodes will at various times have a flawed copy or a copy that is not fully a full copy of the Bitcoin database. Just the same way, if we are not communicating much, not sharing and receiving, then I make the case that our worldview may not be as healthy or full or solid. And this is one of the main reasons why I launched this Bitcoin Worldview project, to engage in this process and invite others to join with me. So that was talking about the question, is communication possible, which was mentioned in the introduction there. Feel free to jump in on that. Otherwise, I'm moving on to talk about how does the Bitcoin protocol acquire and verify knowledge. And to do that, I am going to share my screen. Let's figure that out here. Here we go. Welcome, Stephen, by the way.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, sorry I'm a bit tardy, I guess.
You're all good. You're all good. So, do you see my screen, guys?
I do, yeah.
Okay. So this is what we started with. This is the intro here. We already talked about that, and we talked about the communication question. So this is what we talk about when we talk about a decentralized database as opposed to a centralized database. I'm a software engineer and I work with databases pretty much every week of my life. And all of them, without exception, have been centralized. Those are efficient systems. We use them for sophisticated business software. And we've been using languages to query those databases since, I don't know, I think SQL, structured query language, which I use a lot, got started back in 93 or 95. So it's been going on for almost 30 years and still going strong. So you see the difference there. You know, when you have a centralized database, everything, you know, there's one source of truth in the center. And everything depends on that. When you have a decentralized database, all those nodes or machines are equal. There's not one of them that is more central than another. Now, when we think about that, you know, I looked it up in January or early this year. They were estimating, CoinDesk was estimating there are about 80,000 Bitcoin full nodes. I would say now towards the fourth quarter of this year, there will be at least 100,000, probably 200,000, because there's been a surge in running full node, especially after Elon Musk expressed doubts in July. He expressed doubts that the average person would be running a full node. So after that, everyone is posting on Twitter, hey, Elon, see my Umbrel, you know, Raspberry Pi 4 running a full node. So I don't know if he was using reverse psychology, but whatever he did, it worked. So, and it's been, for me, it has been a great experience to run a full node on a little Raspberry Pi. It's fun. So each one of those full nodes keeps a record of all the Bitcoin transactions from the beginning. And all of them are continually communicating with usually about 10 other nodes to receive and share updates. So they're always receiving and sharing all the time. And then the Bitcoin protocol uses a clever verification process so that all of these full nodes, 100K or 200K, know that their copy of the Bitcoin database is accurate. So let's talk about that a little bit. This is an example or a simple picture of a blockchain. And most of you have already studied that, but just for the point of conversation, you will have these blocks you can think about like pages in an actual spreadsheet. And each page or block has a hash. And a hash is just like a fingerprint. You could take a large file or even a database, and you can create a hash, which is perhaps 16 characters that are unique. If you change one thing in that file and rehash it, the fingerprint or the hash will change. And it's one way. You can go from the file to the hash, but if you have the hash, you cannot go back to the file. So it's one way only. And it's fast and it's easy to verify if the hash is correct. So if I give you a hash and I claim that I solved a mathematical problem, and I give you the hashing of the solution, you can then work on that problem, and then you can hash your solution and verify if it's the same solution that I have, for example. And I will have proven that my solution was correct before looking at your solution. And then the second thing about hashes is that if you look at this picture, you will see there's a chain on the left from block 2 to block 3 to block 5. And each block that follows a block will store the hashing of the prior block. So this way they are all chained together. And that way you know that block 3 came after block 2, because otherwise it would not be possible for block 3 to store the hash of block number 2. Now, if two full nodes disagree on what block should be in the database, the longest chain will win. So if I hold a copy of the database with 5 blocks and John has a copy that only has 3 blocks on his version, the 5 block will win. John will drop his and adapt mine. That's the simple way to put it. The full node with a shorter block will drop his and adapt the longer blockchain. Now, there's more to how Bitcoin works, obviously, and this is not a full description. I'm not talking about miners. I'm not going much detail. But for our metaphors and purposes, this is helpful. And we'll see that come as I continue here. Now, as we've talked about how Bitcoin operates, let's talk a little bit about then switch and talk about how people acquire knowledge and share knowledge. So I'd like to make a distinction between gathering knowledge and verifying knowledge. Today, we all know this. We are increasingly dealing with an avalanche of information that is just washing over us wave after wave, okay? And I think we now deal with more volume of information than any person in history before us. Obviously, we can control that a bit by how much media we consume, but you get the picture. And I'd like to suggest a two-step approach to deal with this enormous volume of information and knowledge that comes our way. First, to think about what are the foundational things for us to know with a reasonable certainty or reasonable confidence. And those core things can operate like cornerstones in our building of worldview and knowledge. We should put more energy into verifying these cornerstones than other items. So we give different weight to the information that we receive. I would suggest, for example, that the topics that we are covering in this series, topics like does fixed truth exist? How do we know? What's the basis of our morality, etc. Those are some of the things that are cornerstones in a healthy, mature worldview. And obviously, before we use them as cornerstones to rigorously verify as much as we can. So having said that, let's dive into how we acquire and gain knowledge. And I suggest 4 ways we do that. You know, there are other ways you can split that up, but I suggest 4. The first would be the simple observation and experiencing the world around us. For example, at a certain age, all of us, as a small child, we literally explore the world by tasting it. You know, small children will just go for a stone or a table and will taste the table. And that is their way of exploring and experiencing the world. And a scientific experiment is a form of experience. If I go and climb a tower and I drop stones and I drop a glass or some various items, my observation will tell me, and I will gain the knowledge that objects fall at the same acceleration regardless of mass. So I'm counting that as observation or experience. That's number 1. Number 2 would be just thinking. The classical examples are Plato, Socrates, and these guys. They were not much into experiments. They would think, they would ask questions, and they would build their knowledge thinking from first principles. They will set down these core axioms or first principles, and based on them, they would think about the world around them. The third way is reading or consuming media of different types. You can potentially count that as experience, but I'm counting that as number 3. And then number 4, having conversations with others or in some ways receiving knowledge from another person. Similar to reading, but this live conversation, I feel that merits a category of its own. So that could be the friend next door, your teacher, or potentially a super person or a deity if you're in that worldview, and you could then potentially call that a revelation. Something that is shared with you, but not in the typical manner. And then how do we verify and evaluate our knowledge? I want to mention 2 things: evidence, and the analogy or metaphor of the Bitcoin blockchain works well here. You know, the blockchain with the longest chain wins. The blockchain with the most work behind it, most effort, is the one that wins. Most energy, essentially, because each block is energy. Proof of work. In a similar way, as we build our worldview, the longest chain of strong evidence should win compared to others. I believe, for example, that the Earth is round because there's more and stronger evidence for that than the Earth being flat, with respect to the flat earthers on the call. So that's the first way we evaluate knowledge, by evidence. The second way would be intuition, or even just your gut feeling. You may disagree if that's a valid evaluation, but let me give you an example. I don't know if you played chess, but an expert chess player, he may decide to sacrifice his knight for a pawn, even if he can't calculate to know with certainty or with confidence that it is a winning move. He will rely on his intuition. He trusts his intuition enough to act on it. And that's my kind of discernment, if it's evaluation, if you're willing to act on it. And then you can play more with the comparison of how Bitcoin operates and how we humans work with knowledge. Like I said earlier, a block of Bitcoin is like a piece of evidence. And if that's your metaphor, then mining a new Bitcoin block takes work, takes effort. The same goes for evidence. Solid evidence is something that usually requires some efforts on our behalf to put our fingers on, to get a hold on. And then number two, there's also a process to verify a Bitcoin block. Although it's more complicated, there's also a process to verify a piece of evidence. We ask other people, we study books, etc. So if we do this comparison between Bitcoin and our human process of dealing with knowledge, number one, in acquiring knowledge, we see that Bitcoin Fullnodes are continually communicating. They're both sharing and receiving. And as humans, a good approach is to continually communicate with others. And the advantage of that is that new evidence is continually being received and shared with others. And the evidence that you already have is being tested, and you help others to test their evidence. So that's kind of the human example. Now, a bad way to deal with knowledge and deal with worldview from a human perspective, I would say, is closing yourself off and not communicating. The mindset of saying, I know truth, and I do not need to do any more listening or sharing. The result of that probably will be ignoring evidence that does really exist. And if you don't know about the evidence, then obviously it will not have any effect on your life, because what you don't know doesn't really exist in your world, in your bubble. That's about acquiring knowledge. There's a second thing about verifying knowledge. That's the thing I said earlier. Bitcoin, the longest chain wins. And for us as humans, the longest chain of strong evidence should win. Once I learn of a longer chain of evidence, I should drop my short chain and adapt the longer chain. Now, a bad way of doing that would be holding fast to the chain I have, ignoring or not knowing that the longer chain exists. So that may take a lot of courage, obviously, especially if those evidence chains are pointed to a cornerstone belief that has a huge implication for one's life. All right. Any questions or comments so far? I have a little bit more to share. All right, thumbs up. All right. So let's ask this question then. Can we trust the knowledge that we verify? Okay. And obviously, the answer to that question depends on what we mean with trust. If my trust means a mathematical proof, like proving that 2 + 2 = 4, then the answer is probably no. Because the amount of knowledge that we can verify like that is very narrow. There's not much knowledge that you can verify with a proof, like you can prove that 2 + 2 = 4. So that would really limit the amount of knowledge that you can have. But if by saying trust, you mean assuming a few axioms, like assuming that fixed truth exists, I can prove that fixed truth exists, but I have evidence for it, and I can lay that as a cornerstone and then work my way from that. And if I do that, that enables me to trust knowledge built on that with enough reasonable confidence to act on it. So if that is the case, then I can trust the knowledge that I verify. Okay. I'm going to borrow here then a phrase from Dr. Michael Guillen, who I've had the pleasure to work with at Atheism also. He has a PhD in physics, astronomy, and math. And he recently published a book called Believing is Seeing. It's actually on the top list of Amazon right now. And he's contrasting believing is seeing against seeing is believing. And let me explain what he means. Seeing is believing is the approach to only believe what you can see and touch and measure. Okay. And there are problems with that, I want to suggest. For example, dark matter and dark energy make up about 95% of the entire universe. That means that 95% of the universe is completely invisible and out of reach for us. That means, in essence, that if we're going to base our understanding about the world just on that 5%, and actually just that fraction of the 5% that we can actually see with our telescopes, etc., that's a very, very narrow hole to look through. Let me bring in a quote from a friend, Mike Brownott. He says, "There's a branch of thought in science which says that you must remain agnostic about the reality of anything that cannot be observed directly with the unaided human senses. This means that you should have no opinion on the reality of atoms. You should have no opinion on the reality or otherwise of electrons or genes or your own brain or even your own children once they've left the room." Okay. So that's a hardcore seeing is believing. I also want to bring up here in this conversation the limits of logic, because we sometimes overstretch what we can do with logic, and that is kind of the camp of seeing is believing. If I can prove with logic that something exists or something is the case, people say that that's the proof. But the problem is that logic has boundaries and logic has limits. Kurt Friedrich Gödel was he studied logic, and he came up with the incompleteness theorem. In very simple terms, he proved that if you have anything that is more complex than arithmetic, you will always have truths that you cannot prove. Let me repeat that. If you have something more complex than arithmetic, plus, minus, division, etc. If you have a statement that is more complex than that, there will always be things, axioms, that you have to have, but you cannot prove them. Otherwise, if you don't have these things, you can't prove or make a case that whatever you're stating is true. He's basically saying that logic has limitations as for how complex a thesis it can deal with. That's really remarkable when you think about it, because that means that we are forced to use methods beyond logic to go into areas that are more complex than arithmetic. Right. Now that was talking about seeing is believing. Let me talk about believing is seeing, and here we're approaching the end here. Believing is seeing, as opposed to seeing is believing, means that when you say believing is seeing, it means that if our worldview is broad enough to believe or have faith in things that can't be seen or may even defy our everyday experience. If that is the case, we can see much more of the universe around us. And we can do that with reasonable reliability because it is consistent with the best available evidence, be it solid or ambiguous. So you have some evidence, but you can't prove it with math or anything like that. You gather the evidence. Augustine was an old church saint here, and he said this: understanding is the reward of faith. Therefore, do not seek to understand in order to believe, but believe that you may understand. That sounds strange at first, but when you think about it, he's really saying that unless you believe some axioms that you can't prove, you will never be able to reach the understanding beyond those axioms. So the axioms operate like a gateway into a building, and you cannot explore the rooms in that building if you're not willing to accept the axioms or basic principles. Another guy, Werner Heisenberg, said, not only is the universe stranger than we think, it is stranger than we can think. Now, that's an interesting statement. He's saying that the universe is stranger than we can think. And he seems to be saying that our thinking will lack the capacity to understand the strangeness of the universe. Let me give you a couple of examples. To go from ground level up to the 20th floor of a tall building, you need to take the elevator or climb the stairs. Even Superman or Superwoman would need to at least cover the distance. Okay, even if Superman could skip the elevator. Okay, so an atom is like a skyscraper with many floors. And according to quantum physics, electrons, they can, and they do, go from one floor to another without traversing the floors in between. Quite literally, they dematerialize from one floor and instantaneously rematerialize on another. Okay, so I have never seen this happen, but based on the authority of the scientific community who are able to measure this, I believe this is true. This defies my everyday experience, because if you move something in everyday experience, it needs to travel the distance. But I personally believe this is true, that atoms operate like this, okay, because there's evidence for it. Let me give you one more example. That ties into communication. Have you heard about quantum entanglement? Okay, so quantum entanglement, when you think about communication, usually it takes time to deliver a message from A to B. Even if we are having this conversation now over Zoom, I know that my voice, there's a latency on my voice being delivered to your ear, even if it's amazingly fast. But this latency doesn't necessarily exist in the world of quantum mechanics or quantum physics. For instance, an electron will have a spin on it, either clockwise or counterclockwise. And let's suppose that two electrons come from the same atom and they fly apart like twins separated at birth, and each of them with a certain spin. If you measure the spin of one electron, that will instantaneously affect the spin of the other. It's like they have this telepathic communication. If you measure one of them and you affect the spin, the other one will, at the same time, without any latency, show the same change in spin. And this is called quantum entanglement. It has been shown by many experiments. In one recent study at the University of Science and Technology of China in Hefei, they were able to have them separated by 746 miles, but they were still able to communicate with one another instantaneously. That's mind-blowing. No latency, 746 miles. So in theory, where my mind goes with that is that if you take one of those electrons to the known end, one end of the known universe, and the other to the other end of the known universe, in theory, you would be able to communicate or Morse between the whole universe without any latency, instantaneously. That defies my normal everyday experience, but yet you can buy a $1,000 kit and you can do this experiment. And there are many, many other examples that defy our normal everyday experience, but for science, it's normal stuff, really, that they have been using and measuring and working with for decades. So that kind of brings me to my conclusion that if we are going to limit ourselves with just what we can touch and measure, our knowledge volume is very narrow and doesn't seem to reflect the world we live in. And if I bring it back to the question I started with, how do we know? We know by not demanding that we can prove everything like we prove 2 + 2 = 4. And we open up our world for things that may look different than our normal everyday experience, as long as we rigorously verify and look at the evidence that is available to us. And with that, we can build our worldview if we have the courage to follow the evidence where it leads. So let me pause here and we're gonna switch to questions and conversations. Thank you for being a great audience. Hi, Mr. Farrell, good to see you. So what do you guys say? Any questions, comments?
Dr. Farrell, I'm kind of curious, what do you think about these really strange findings in quantum mechanics that Agust is mentioning? Those are really kind of, I don't know, violated the logic intuitions I have about things. Yeah. I don't know, how do you square those findings with like your everyday sense of like logic, you know, like surely if something goes from A to B, it's got to cross the distance between, you know?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can, to be frank.
Yeah.
It, like August said, it defies any normal experience. Even any of the strangest experiences I've had, it defies all of those too.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know a whole lot about quantum entanglement. I've heard the term, heard that before from someone else, but I haven't. It's not something that I've studied or looked into. It is fascinating. It almost begs the question of: is there a higher dimension that is sort of in and through everything, where there are connections that we have no way of accessing, or maybe we do, but we just don't know how to. We don't know how to measure it yet. Or is it some function of the way we're measuring the response of the electron that is kind of almost causes a glitches out reality in some way? I don't know. I'd be curious to really look. In fact, I'm kind of inspired now to look further into it, because I had heard it before, but it's something that I've kind of forgotten and let go of. But yeah, that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I know there are kind of two overall camps that you can have about cases like that. One person can think that the findings that we have in these experiments are certainly paradoxical, but the contradiction is only seeming somehow. There's only a contradiction because these people would argue because our measurements, our equipment, it's not picking up everything. And if we really did have a full understanding of what's happening, we would see that this isn't a violation of logic. But then you have the other camp, which would say, maybe this is a genuine case where our everyday rules of logic seem to not apply. And those people could be people who think that nonetheless, those rules are pretty dang reliable and only fringe cases like these, or they might be even more cynical towards logic and might think that cases like this damage our ability to rely on it even more than just, a few fringe cases. So yeah, I don't know quite where I land between those two camps, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you can see even similar cases like that on a longer time scale. There is some lag time, but you can see cases like that among collections of living things where there is this communication that seems to be happening that's not something we understand in any way. If you've ever seen a flock of starlings flying and noticed their movements and their choreography, I don't know how you really explain how they move the way that they do. I mean, much less why they move that way. That's out of that's a whole nother question. But how they even choreograph themselves with seemingly what seems like does. I mean, they're not even making a whole lot of noise when they're doing that, or even honestly looking at ants and bees. These animals that have massive communities, but are able to build something beautiful, which to us seems like you'd need to have some kind of plan ahead of time, almost a look into the future. Like, here's the consequences of these actions, and here's our kind of our trajectory. We're all going to follow that. But, logic would tell us there is no plan, but yet the thing emerges and it's able to operate and it's able to flourish. So there must be some kind of communication happening, and also almost like an epi-intelligence that sits above the individual. So I don't know. It's all so fascinating to me.
I think it's a helpful conversation because at least today, and like here in Iceland, for young people, there's a lot of assuming that what you see is what you get, What you measure is what you get, and you don't need to talk long about the examples that you brought up just now, or some of them that I brought up, to realize that there is a vast amount of knowledge and truths out there which you can't prove. You can't prove it, at least not with the methods and the approaches that we have now. So that leaves us with the question, okay, am I going to deny that this is true? Or am I going to upgrade my worldview and say, if I have evidence for it, if I see the ants, if I see the birds, if I can measure the quantum entanglement, it does exist, even if I can't work out the mechanics or if I can't prove it. And once you settle that, then, like I hinted at in my section there, then the distance between science and faith has just gotten much shorter. And I agree with Dr. Guillen when he points out in his book that really both science and religion are operating on faith, where faith is certain axioms that you put down which you cannot prove.
Yeah, one thing that that kind of strikes me about these cases that seem to be kind of flouting logic a little bit. To me, they would actually almost be I don't know. I don't think someone who is only relying on, if someone's only relying on the unaided senses, you're right, that they would have a hard time believing these things. But people who are kind of drawn to those positions usually wouldn't limit themselves to just the unaided senses. There's a view called, and it kind of had its heyday a while ago. It's not very popular anymore, and for a number of reasons. Logical positivism, which you may have come across. And it's basically the view that the only claims that have meaning are ones that can be empirically falsified. So if a claim, there's no way to falsify a claim empirically, then that claim doesn't have any meaning, is what they would say. And so that's very much kind of like a technical way of basically saying, if you can't measure it, doesn't even make sense what you're saying.
Yeah.
So, that view has certainly a number of problems, but I don't think someone who has that view would have much issue with these puzzling findings in quantum mechanics. I think they would see those and be like, well, we can empirically measure it, so it does have meaning. I think, if anything, those cases would actually be a threat to people like us who want to say that we can rely on logic without always empirical, without more sentences have meaning than just ones that can be empirically verified. I think actually that would be more of a problem for us than for them. I don't know.
What do you guys think about some of the simple metaphors that I drew from how Bitcoin operates and how we operate in gathering and verifying knowledge? Do you find that helpful, or what do you think?
I liked your longest block proof of work, following the chain of evidence. So I did a study once asking people about three questions. I did a 3-question test. Do you believe that it's important to have evidence for your belief system? People said yes. I wouldn't believe some without evidence. Number 2, what is your most deeply held belief? And number 3, what evidence do you have to support that? And inevitably, when you took people down that path, they began to go, oh my God, yeah. They had number 2 was not supported by number 3 a lot of times. So it is interesting how we think we like to think we're all evidence-based and we think a certain way, but there are certain things that we just don't have evidence for that we hold to. Like there's some truths that are just self-evident, the founders would say. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. So there's no empirical method to measure, net worth or bench press. We're not measuring that, but yet we hold inherently that all people are created of equal value and worth and dignity. And so to uphold human rights is to uphold some kind of axiom that we just can't prove, So I think it's interesting, but in some areas that you can prove, it is helpful to have, based on your experience observation, what has that longer chain. So if you thought it was one thing, but there's more evidence in another area, then even though you may not be able to prove it, if it's 60% this answer, 40% that answer, then without a reasonable doubt, I'm going to say this guy committed the murder, based on the evidence that was presented to me. And so I'm never going to be 100% sure, but I'm more leaning towards it based on what I see than when I have questions about. So, but we like to think we need 100% certainty, but most of life we don't have 100% certainty in that way of a mathematical proof that people think about. So I think it is pretty helpful for people to understand the whole trust and proof and faith, to really get that clear, to realize that religion and science both are operating at some degree on faith, axioms they can't prove. And once you see that, it does change the way you begin to, it helps to remove a little bit of self-deception that people have, which is why I think the whole Bitcoin discussion has been helpful for many people, because they think they operate without fixed truth, for instance, and then they come to Bitcoin and suddenly they see some fixed truth and they start seeing certain principles that line up with reality that don't really fit with postmodernity. And then suddenly it causes them to start questioning the other beliefs they have, and they start down this rabbit hole of all this questioning, which I think is helpful and good, but many people just don't. I think it was Blaise Pascal that said that part of the problem in the world is we don't sit alone and think enough, so we don't really think about what we believe. And so if you do, you start to uncover a lot of things that we don't think about. We just watch media and go on with our lives. And Bitcoin for many has forced them to start thinking at a deeper level.
Do you guys agree that when I was sharing earlier, I said that one, communication is possible, and that you can verify and have real knowledge? That's kind of where I landed. Do all you agree with that, or what's your summary on that?
Yeah, I think, those all sound pretty reasonable claims to me. Yeah. I think I might be a little bit more pessimistic, though, about the things with which we can be certain about. I share your conclusion that even if we can't be certain about something, that doesn't mean we can't know it to, one, a very high degree of confidence, and two, that high degree of confidence is enough to count as knowledge. But I'm not even too sure that mathematical, very basic mathematical proofs, like in arithmetic, can 100, would be certain, because it kind of depends on what you mean by numbers. There's a debate in philosophy about whether or not numbers really exist. Do mathematicians discover things or invent things? So yeah, I don't know if I'm even too 100% sure about 2 + 2 equaling 4. Now, if you hold all the axioms of basic arithmetic, then you can know. But that's kind of the point. The axioms themselves have to be assumed. Yeah.
But then again, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's kind of where postmodernity kind of defeats itself. It's like, we're communicating right now. Is communication possible? Well, let me give you my opinion. Well, it's like, am I communicating my opinion or am I not? So it's like, how do we say communication isn't possible and communicate that? So it's like, we're either communicating or we're not communicating. So it's like, we can say we're not communicating, and yet if you're communicating that you can't communicate, then you just defeated it. So it's interesting how, that can be so self-defeating. There is some level of, as you said, Stephen, you have to accept those axioms, like Euclidean geometry. You have to accept that there's a dimensionless point. There's a line that exists without a plane. You have to if you accept all those axioms, then man, you can do geometry. It's amazing, and you get all the benefits of it. But if you reject it, I don't think 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, well then you'll never have the benefit of knowing how to add how many children you have or how much money's in your bank account if you reject numbers. You have to kind of accept by faith these numbers that were invented or discovered or whatever in order to enjoy the benefits of mathematics and begin to explain the universe and whatnot. So it's this weird thing of we want the certainty, but we realize we have to just assume the axioms. And if we believe them, as Dr. G says, then we can really begin to the believing is seeing. Now we begin to see the whole world begins to open up to us if we start with those axioms.
Yeah, it's when you were talking, Stephen, it's refreshing to hear your take on some of those, because what I hear from you is that you want to narrow down the metaphysical. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
But doing that, and I know you agree with me on that, it is a narrow road, because if you go too far in that, you are really sawing off the limb that you're standing on. Because if you use advanced metaphysical and philosophical statements to show why metaphysical truths don't exist, then the pipeline you're operating on gets quite narrow there. So it's a fine line.
Yeah, there's all kinds of kind of ironic places you can wind up if you take the project to the extreme of limiting the number of things you either assume or because quite humorously you can end up in a place where being very conservative about the things that you assume, and by conservative I mean only limiting as much as you possibly can the number of things you're willing to assume. Mm-hmm. Well, that motivation that someone would have would probably be based in part on some assumptions. Like, the fewer number of assumptions I have, the safest, or the least likely I am to be misled. Well, that itself might be an assumption, so I guess just the overall desire to have the least amount of axioms as one needs, that in itself might require a few axioms, which, you can.
Yeah, good. Yeah, well said. If we switch gears a little bit, one of the things I was talking about was good ways of building a worldview and bad ways of building a worldview. And I was making the case that a person that is neglecting to communicate with others or kind of closing him or herself off will be more likely to have a bad worldview than the person that is more open and rigorous and then verifying evidence. Do you agree with that assumption or that conclusion that I made, or do you have any thoughts on that?
I 100% agree with that statement. The more you squeeze a person or a group of people and censor what they can and can't expose themselves to, or even talk about amongst themselves, the constellation of ideas becomes very, very minimal, right? It's not as bright, it's not as beautiful. There's not the opportunity to explore what connects somebody to life, because everybody's different in that way. And truth becomes just very limited to that very small view, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. I certainly have seen that in my life and seen what I was exposed to growing up versus what I found out later in life and wish I was exposed to earlier in life and wouldn't have to do so much dusting off and kind of disentangling myself from some of those old ideas. But yeah, it's tough because, I mean, without the tools of weighing the evidence, which I think is absolutely important if you're going to expose somebody to all these different ideas and say, you go figure it out for yourself for a little while. Then you also need to expose that person to the tools for weighing the evidence, right? Because otherwise, then people are not grounded in anything, and any wave that comes along can just blow them off their rocker. And so there must be some foundational kind of anchors to hold people and make it less likely that they're going to, wash this way or that. As we've seen in the US over the last year and a half, it doesn't take a whole lot of bad press and misinformation to convince some people that this is true or that's true or that's false. But keeping all avenues open and then looking at the evidence for each one and saying, I don't know, which we're terrible at doing in the US, saying I don't know. I don't know, but here's my best guess at this point, based on the evidence that we have. And I think the voices that were pronouncing those narratives earlier on, at least in the COVID thing, were much more easily able to shift their perspective when new evidence came out. And it wasn't so shocking to everybody. But yeah, I am definitely for the least amount of censorship, so far as it doesn't cause damage or suffering to people, which obviously some ideas can, I think, but those which don't, then let them out.
Yeah, that's actually something that would be very interesting to spend some more talking about, even the correlation between the level of people's ability to think, because I would suggest that as people's ability to think critically goes down, you may need to increase what is being shared with them, because they will just grab anything and run with it without thinking critically about it. So more and more information becomes dangerous for them because they are not able to responsibly deal with it. Another thing that I wanted to ask you guys about is as for Bitcoin, if you go back to that a little bit, one of the things I found really interesting about Bitcoin is that I've heard from a lot of people, both here in Iceland and abroad, that as they have been studying Bitcoin, their worldview has changed. And they are thinking more critically about the world. And their time preference, for example, has changed. They think much more long-term than before. And I'm fascinating how a piece of software which is speech, so to speak, information, how that is impacting literally millions around the world in how they think. So I was just curious if you guys have any thoughts on that. Yeah.
To be honest, this is like a little bit of kind of a new thing to stumble on. For me, I've known about Bitcoin for a while, and I've been a little bit of a amateur philosophy nerd for a while too. But when I first encountered this intersection between kind of Bitcoin, and I don't want to call it self-help because that sounds almost like not good. Like, it's deeper than just self-help too. There's some real like kind of philosophy going on there too. Anyways, yeah, it almost kind of struck me weird. Like, it seemed like these two opposite worlds. This software related, cryptocurrency, and then I almost thought they're kind of different. But it's been really interesting seeing the overlap, and I can kind of see why, because there are a few analogous things to Bitcoin that one could make in epistemology and things like that. So,
yeah, thank you.
I was just going to say, August, it feels like most people don't really understand Bitcoin until they understand the current monetary system. So, like a lot of books and blogs, and they try to teach you Bitcoin. They try to say, look, here's how the Fed works, central banks work, the current monetary system works. So that once you can see how it's dysfunctional, how it's broken, then you go, oh my gosh, Bitcoin, it can help go a long way towards alleviating that or fixing that or putting us back in the right direction with sound money. So, but I think the revelation begins, this is my opinion, I think that people realize they've been lied to about money, that they want you to be confused about it, not understand it. And so, if you're going to learn a certain thing in the university setting, the teachers will teach you a certain thing, and the banks will pay the professor to teach something. And so you kind of self-perpetuate to make sure people are all confused and don't really question things. They just accept you need a little bit of inflation every year. It's just how the economy works, and they don't really understand sound money. But once they realize that, they go, wow, Bitcoin's amazing. They think, wait a minute, if I've been lied to about money, either lied to or if you don't want to go that extreme, you just say, well, I've been misinformed, or I just didn't know. What else have I been lied to, or what else have I not really thought critically enough about? Religion, maybe, or food, or big pharma, or they just start going all kind of directions, beginning to say, I'm going to start applying this new critical thinking I've learned, and I'm going to start applying it to other areas. And then they start beginning to realize how many other areas you're getting misinformation. You're getting, as Robert Breedlove calls it, noise among the signal. It's like, and bad money messes a lot of that up. I think about China, where everybody puts like 70% of the country puts their store of value in real estate. And so if everybody's putting their money in real estate, people will invest ahead of time before a home's even built. And so you would think, man, must be a lot of people moving to China, must be a lot of babies happening, must be a lot of growth. And so you just keep doing it. And pretty soon you build out, like that company Evergrande, you have 1.7 million properties that are empty or partially finished with no one to move into it, just because people think, because the signal they're getting is really a bunch of noise saying, oh, real estate is booming here. That's where I should invest. That's where I invest, because we have a centrally planned economy where people think I know it all. But not having a free market, letting people actually move and say, I want a house, and bid the prices up, then you'd have a real accurate, you'd know whether or not, was it a real signal that the housing market needs to grow, or was that noise? And so as a result, you have this huge misallocation of capital where Evergrande goes bust and all these properties sit empty. And remember last month, they blew up 15 high rises that had sat empty for 8 years or more. So you just have all this wasted stuff. So we always think that we know better. And like they don't know what they're doing. There's a lot of politics that way, right? You guys know what you're doing. We're smart. We'll tell you what to think. We'll centrally plan everything instead of letting the market itself dictate what kind of, having states pick health policies or education policies and kind of see the best one win, the best ideas. No. We want one idea, whether it's tested or not. We'll push it from the top. Everybody has to do this idea. And then we don't know. We lose our control group. We don't know if it was bad or good, But if you allow more of that free market, you begin to see, that state did a better job here, this state did a better job here, this university did a better job here. And certain ones will get money, will get enrollment, will get people moving to their state, get people buying in their company. And you'll see, those kind of booms and bust kind of flattened. But there's just too much central planning going on in a lot of different sectors where we think we're doing it for the good of the people who don't know any better and don't have time to think about it. But I think what it does, it creates a lot of noise and a lot of booms and busts and a lot of misallocation and misinformation. And people, ironically, through the internet, which can be a source for truth and misinformation, is helping people to see, what they're not exposed to. Obviously, you have social media stuff where it keeps feeding you in your own little bubble, and so you just never know. But if you get into a truly decentralized information bubble where you're constantly having opposing ideas to refine what you think, and then now you have more confidence going, okay, it's not just that I thought about Bitcoin, but I looked at all the alternatives. I looked at gold, I looked at fiat. I go, when I look at alternatives, Bitcoin looks pretty good to me. That's, if I had to put money, that's where I'm going to put my money. So in the same way, you think about faith, you think about worldviews. Is this worldview true? Does it answer everything? It answers a lot. Well, let me compare it to 5 other major worldviews in the world, and then you start looking. You go, man, when I compare to other worldviews, this one looks a lot better than I thought individually when I looked at it. Just because, what are the alternatives? What best corresponds to that reality that we see?
Yeah, I'll echo Addison as well in saying that the thing that, I mean, personally, I didn't know much about the financial markets, and I still don't. It's very confusing to me. Our architecture of the way money is oriented and the way that it is spread out across our economy is very confusing. But I have educated myself more since I've become privy to the cryptocurrency world. And yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating how what seems like the powers that be, the big banks and the governments are, critical of the cryptocurrency ecosystem as being scammy and as being unstable, which there's some merit to that, because there are going to be scams and instability anytime there's something new that emerges. People are going to take advantage of other people. But what's very interesting is that this kind of taking advantage of people has been going on for decades in the large banking. So you just don't hear about it because it's conversations that are behind closed doors, and occasionally, we'll get a leak here or there that will sort of expose the beast that lies in there, of how corrupt some of these systems are. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody knows. I want to meet that person, the one who knows, who's seen the beast in full, like who's the person to go to who kind of like has seen like all the, kind of just knows what's going on. Okay, these pieces are moving over here and those pieces are moving. This is why that's happening. I think that'd be a fascinating bed of knowledge to have, but and maybe a little bit scary too. But yeah, I think that I have educated myself on things that I never would have before jumping into this world. And also, like, you do have those opposing ideas that come to a head. And it's nice to expose yourself to that. Like, I know personally, I get on Reddit quite a lot, and, there's a sub, the cryptocurrency sub, and, people can bash that sub. But what's interesting is that the people who are on there will bash the sub themselves. And it's nice to see that there are critical eyes that are operating within this community of people who are willing to criticize themselves and the way that things run in this thing. And I think you need that. You can't be so sure of yourself and sure of your ideas if it's got to be that voice that's in the corner that's saying, well, I don't know, so I don't know about this. Here's an alternative explanation. Here's an alternative idea. I want you to think about this. And I think that for me, at least, I find those posts and those comments reassuring, like, hey, these people are actually thinking with an open mind about this whole thing and trying to move things forward in this ecosystem and try to make things better, but at the same time realizing the limitations that are there. And that's something that I've found refreshing in this community that you don't see in a lot of places that are just kind of tooting their own horn the whole time.
Well said. Well said. Atheism was was putting out there Bitcoin needs better critics, and I think that's a great point. I want to point out that just like you were saying, and I will often say this, the idea is to express and communicate our ideas about the world freely. Communicate, debate the evidence, and then the hope is that the best idea wins. This is kind of the open source mentality. The free expression, the free market and expression of code, the free market and expression of speech and ideas, right? And that seems to work well for us humans if we let the ideas compete for what works best. So I just want to point that out, that there are real similarities there between free speech, the debating of ideas in our communities, open source, which Bitcoin is. Anyone can download the source code, try this out. So it really is a seamless connection there between these things. And then, people have been hammering and going after Bitcoin from January 2009, actually before. I'm reading the book of Satoshi now, everything that Satoshi wrote, and people are on the threads where he's communicating, asking him questions, what about this? How does this work? Is this a hole? Is this a weakness? And they're debating it back and forth. The very same thing that we're talking about here about worldview and ideas. In community, you work out what works best, and that really is what we're doing with this Bitcoin Worldview project. We will now come together and talk and have the conversation, and that way our thinking gets stronger and the best idea hopefully wins. Another thing I'm going to pick up from what you said, Addison, is that you were talking about being self-sovereign and you were talking about critical thinking. And I think there's a connection there that if you learn to be self-sovereign, if you build that, it will build your critical thinking, because you go into the mentality of not blindly accepting just anything or being dependent on the state or being dependent on someone else really taking responsibility for your life. You step into being responsible for your life and for your thinking, and that's critical thinking. So I see Bitcoin building that, because one of the big things that Bitcoin is advocating for is this idea to be self-sovereign. I can run my little Raspberry Pi here in my basement, and with that little thing, I can send money. I can send value across the earth, and nobody can stop me, and nobody can take it away from me. So that's being self-sovereign. Okay. Any comments on that? Otherwise, we're gonna start wrapping this up here soon. But I want to give room if there are any additional comments, questions, etc.
One quick thing is I actually really enjoyed Addison's thing about the 3 questions. Should we base our beliefs on evidence? What's your most cherished beliefs? What's your evidence? Yeah, I thought that was, it's kind of a cool, concise way to get across that message and need to have reasons for belief. I thought that was really cool.
You're muted, August. I can't hear August. I don't know if you can.
Yeah, I can't hear. Yeah, I can't hear you, August.
Oh yeah, sorry. Thank you, Stephen. That's great. Yeah. We might pick you up on that and just have an episode just on that. I enjoyed that also, Addison. That's a great short way of starting a conversation.
I got that from a professor. So for a reason and faith class, and I had to go interview people with those questions. It was quite enlightening.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, Addison, do you have any memorable interactions with people that's to stand out?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one that stood out to me was when I recorded. It's like an hour and a half long. I asked the guy for permission to record it. But it was a guy who was the president of Muslim Student Association at the campus here locally. And I asked him what is, evidence. He was all about evidence, this and that. I think it was a computer science major or something. And then the second thing I said, what was your biggest beliefs? And he said, I'm Muslim. So I went through the 5 pillars. And I asked, what those were. He explained them all. And then I asked him what evidence he had for that. And he simply said, oh, well, the Quran. And I said, well, I just kind of played, idiot. I said, well, I don't understand. What do you mean Quran? That's the book. I go, okay. So, but for the Quran, how do you know you can trust the Quran? What evidence do you have that that's true? Did he write it when he was alive? Well, no, somebody else wrote it. When did they write it? Oh, hundreds of years later. Well, how do you know they wrote what he said? And then he was just shaking. He was like, man, I don't want to believe a lie. And he said, I'm gonna have to ask my dad because my dad's real smart on this. But he started visibly shaking. Was like, man, I do not want to believe a lie. And he was just like, thanking me. Thank you so much for this conversation. And he started asking me questions about my faith and, evidence for Christianity. And I just thought it was pretty interesting that approach opened him up. And he was like, man, I really enjoyed this conversation. I've never really talked to a Christian before. We talk about them, never talked to them. And I said, yeah, I can talk all day. So we just went for an hour and a half. It was supposed to be like a quick 15-minute little exercise. And but it was just amazing how much it opened him up and how much it really planted a kind of inception, planted that seed in there that I'm just trusting to cause him to go down a rabbit hole.
Wow. That's really fascinating. To me, what's fascinating is it seems like he had never considered those questions before.
Well, you're not allowed to consider them. In his faith, if you question, the leaders like apostate, you can't do it.
Right. Wow.
That's why you have to have a worldview that says, I think earlier Stephen mentioned this about like Karl Popper falsification. Like if Paul says, if the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is not true. So it's the only faith that says if this didn't happen, it's not true. So it puts all the money on the table like a Texas Hold'em poker. If this didn't happen, it's not true. And so it gives a place in which you can kind of falsify the faith. And other things don't really do that. So it's just an interesting, interesting dynamic.
It's an excellent conversation. I've had several of these conversations with young people here in Iceland, and that's actually one of the things that has surprised me. If you approach it the right way, people will thank me, and they will appreciate the conversation if you gently ask the question and you talk about evidence, because most people really do want to build their worldview on evidence. They just often haven't made the connection, it seems. So it would be interesting to hear of those that will listen to this podcast, if they have any feedback on that, if they've given thought to the evidence that they build their worldview on, because we all have some worldview, even if we've put it on paper or put it into words or not. And we all live in this same world. We live on this earth, and our worldview is basically how we interpret the world around us. So we are going to wrap this up. Thank you for the conversation, guys, and engaging with me on this topic. I really appreciate that. We are having Dr. Gabe Bouts joining us for our next session 2 weeks from now. That will be October 26th at the same time. The topic title is Math Behind the Matter. And the description is, those that dive into Bitcoin are usually surprised to discover how deep and far-reaching implications it has on human life and environment. Bitcoin is software, information, math, and cryptology. And yet it is already starting to describe a new and updated physical future for human flourishing. Surprisingly, math is effective in describing and predicting developments in our physical world. Why is that? Why does math work? So we continue to really be close to what you were mentioning, Stephen, about metaphysics, because obviously numbers are information, metaphysics. And I'm really looking forward to hear Gabe's take on this, and hopefully you can join me for conversations and Q&A. So thank you all. hopefully see you next time.